The title of this video is body paragraphs, particularly body paragraphs in the introduction. The reason I've got this slide is because body paragraphs in the introduction can be the hardest paragraphs to write, be really difficult. You know your work, you know the principles that you've applied, you've built something, you've measured something, you've got the data, but now you need to actually compare it to other pieces of work. That can actually be extremely hard work in and of itself, and if you haven't had much experience of it, it will be the hardest part of the paper to write. I have absolutely no doubt. So let's talk about body paragraphs. Let's talk about our old funnels friends again. You don't beat the funnels. Again, the body paragraphs start general and then zoom in. The first paragraph may provide some signposts for body paragraphs, but the paragraphs and the order of paragraphs are reasonably expected. Paragraphs just don't come out of the blue. They are linked to the paragraph in front of them, and you can follow the daisy chain. You should actually be able to read the first sentence of every paragraph in an introduction, and it should tell a story all by itself. One way of summarizing, incidentally, is something called reverse outlining, where you take the first sentences of every paragraph and you look at those sentences and you see, does everything fit together clearly? Is a single idea followed through that then carries from one paragraph to the next? Let's look at some of the questions that body paragraphs have to address. You have to say what other people did. Why did you do what you do? Now, a point that you need to understand is that why you did what you did, you may not have an answer to this question before you do something. You may just be applying general principles and you come to a solution, you've created something, and then afterward you need to retrofit this piece of work with respect to other pieces of work. So you may look at what you've done and then look elsewhere and decide that what was out there is actually a reason to do your work, even though you didn't have that reason when you started, and it's a legitimate move to do that. We expect that papers will not be written from start to finish. Consequently, readers do not expect engineering papers to necessarily come up with all the reasons for doing the work before the work is done, because the work can be done independently, by and large, of what's out there. It's only when you're publishing that you have to refer to that body of work and link it. So why did you do it? You don't need to have that answer up front. The burden of answering that question is not on you immediately. There are other questions that you have to address. If there are a few options out there, you need to decide which is best. You need to look at the limitations and the advantages and be fair in doing so. Let's look at some of the sentences. Well, the first sentence of a body paragraph is essentially a claim. It's a topic. It should be a single idea. The claim needs to be supported by some grounds and some evidence. Sometimes the strength of this claim is questionable, and you can attack claims when you're reading things, and you should be looking for strong support. But you also need to be generous when you read and give people benefit of the doubt to some extent. So let's talk about a model for how a paragraph works. If the first sentence is a claim, it needs to have grounds for that claim and a warrant, a reason why the grounds apply. Let's look at some examples. A simple example is a claim. There are dogs nearby. The grounds, well, you hear barking and howling. And the reason for that is, well, dogs are animals that bark and howl. Well, that's a pretty general example. Let's look at a more specific example in a scientific context. You claim that additional research on something is required for better understanding something. You make that claim on the grounds that somebody else looked at it, but they didn't look at something from a particular perspective. And then the general support for that is, well, if something lacks a certain perspective, some additional research would be helpful to fill that in. So that's still fairly generic, but it's moving much more in the direction of a paper. So here's some topics and claims. Paying with cash is more secure than paying by credit card. Yeah, maybe. You need to provide some evidence for that. All of these things that you're putting forward need evidence. So the next questions are the evidence for that. What is the point of writing it? What's the purpose? Why is it important? You need to give evidence for those sorts of things. Sometimes just sitting there and thinking about what is it and why is it important is all I've had, and it's helped me through several occasions. I've just been sitting there beating my head against the wall trying to figure out how to progress this introduction. Let's look at a more complicated example but using the same ideas as before. So there are dogs nearby, you hear barking, but there may be something else nearby that can bark. So that's the rebuttal. The support is that dogs are animals that bark and howl, and the backing for that support is that you know that your neighbour has 2 large German Shepherds. So you've got a reason to believe that, you've got evidence, so you apply that to the claim. So a more complicated paragraph might deal with other options. It might deal with some reasons for why you can use that support. Let's go back into the computer science domain. This is again, additional research is required. So a rebuttal for that is, well, there might be new research anyway. It hasn't been published. The warrant for it, when a paper lacks a certain perspective, more research would help. And then the backing for that is a thorough review has shown you that that no further research has been done. So you're able to take this model and apply it to paragraphs. But one thing you need to do is to process information, to look across multiple papers and find areas of similarity, because those areas of similarity and those areas of difference then provide grounds and they provide the rebuttal. So let's have a look at an example from electronic engineering. So this paper was around a survey of fault diagnosis and fault tolerant techniques. It's got over 1,000 references. So look at what's happened here. They've sliced and diced information. They've sliced it across time in terms of decades from the 70s to the early 2000s. They've sliced it by method, and they've also sliced it by application and different flavours of each of those. So they've created categories, they've created boxes. So the paragraph above talks about the survey papers, but the box is really the prize here. If you're looking for fault diagnosis applications from the early 2000s, bang, you've got direct access into the literature. This is a great way of being able to help people. And this is probably why this paper has over 1,000 references, because people are using it to target specific publications. They're using the categories within the paper. And as I've said in the past, literature surveys are really powerful things to read because it gives you a good sense of the categories. The writing underneath the table, they're then going into the details around these particular categories. So each paragraph will then deal with fault diagnosis methods, for example, or something else. So having an understanding of how you can look at papers and look at categories is important. Let's give you a tool to do that. Well, the basic tool is the matrix. As you're aware, papers come in pretty much the same form, and that form gives you the advantage of being able to line papers up. You can look at the research topics, the method, the findings, the limitations, areas for future research. You can line all these papers up next to each other. If you do a large literature survey with several hundred papers, these matrices become absolutely crucial. And with the tools that we now have, looking for similar terms is much easier than it used to be. So once you've got this matrix, you then start color coding in there, looking for similarities. Where are people doing the similar sort of thing? That table that I showed, this is a slice of it, and it's found similarities between several papers on particular topics. In the finding, they've identified Facebook. In the limitations, they've looked at the focus on GPA. In the areas for future research, they've looked at performance. So these things combined by just looking at a whole number of papers can be used to structure paragraphs. You've obviously got to know what papers to look at, but once you've actually sliced and diced them and deconstructed them using the structures provided in this course, you can then start to put together categories that it can allow you to write those painful body paragraphs. So you can produce something like the next page. So here's an abstract based on the previous matrix. So they've started with the papers, started with the matrix. The paper's all about the relationship between Facebook and academic performance. And that was the vibe that you were starting to get when you're looking at those color codings in the matrix. And you can see how the colors in this slide relate to the categories in the table that were identified in the previous slides.